By sundown, every soul in Cedar Ridge would remember the moment the woman they laughed at became the only one a motherless child would not let go. Nell Harper stood in the middle of Main Street with mud on the hem of her brown dress, flour dust still caught in the seams of her sleeves, and the last pieces of her life spread across two rough tables in front of Haskett's General Store. An auction sign hung crooked from a nail. Estate goods and unpaid lodging balance, it read, though Nell had no estate and no lodging left to balance. A chipped wash basin, 3 tin plates, a sewing basket with the handle cracked, one wool blanket patched so many times it looked like a map of places she had survived. And on the far end of the table, folded neat as Sunday manners, lay her old white apron. The apron had belonged to her mother before it belonged to Nell, and it had known bread dough, berry stains, winter soup, and every quiet morning when work was the only thing that kept shame from swallowing her whole. Mr. Haskett lifted it with 2 fingers like it was something pulled from a ditch. "Who'll give me 5 cents for this?" he called. "Plenty of cloth there, I reckon." Laughter rolled over the boardwalk. Nell kept her hands folded in front of her. She had learned years ago that if she moved too fast, people laughed harder. Mrs. Violet Harrow stood beneath the striped awning of the milliner's shop, gloved hands tucked around her reticule, her chin raised like judgment itself had rented space beneath her bonnet. 5 cents, she said loudly. "Mercy, Mr. Haskett. You would need a whole flour sack to make that woman another one." A few men chuckled. A young clerk looked away and smiled into his sleeve. Nell stared at the dust between her shoes. She told herself it was only sound. Laughter was only breath with cruelty inside it. Could not break bone. It could not change the shape of her soul. Then Mrs. Harrow stepped closer, her voice sweet enough to curdle cream. Poor Nell Harper. Too fat to be loved, too poor to be pitied, and too late to be saved. The whole street went still for half a heartbeat before the laughter came again, bigger this time, fed by permission. Nell's fingers tightened around nothing. Across the street, Caleb Whitfield had just come out of the feed office with 6 children strung behind him like grief had tied them together and forgotten to loosen the knots. Thomas, 14, stood stiff as a fence post. Clara, 12, held little Millie's hand. Henry kicked at the dust. Rose watched without blinking. Luke had one thumb hooked in Caleb's coat. Caleb himself was tall, sun-browned, and silent under a black hat, the kind of widowed rancher folks lowered their voices around because his house had gone quiet in a way no neighbor knew how to fix. He had come to town for oats, lamp oil, and nails. He had not come to rescue anybody. Nell knew men like him only from a distance. Men with land. Men with names that stayed painted on gates. Men who looked through women like her because looking too long might invite gossip. She did not blame him for it. A woman learned not to blame the weather for being cold. Mr. Haskett gave the apron a lazy little shake. "Come now. Nobody wants it." Just then, a gust of Wyoming wind rushed between the buildings, slapped the apron from his hand, and sent it skidding into the mud near the wagon ruts. Another laugh rose, but before Nell could step forward, Millie Whitfield slipped free from her sister's hand and ran into the street. "Millie," Caleb called, sharp but not angry. The little girl did not stop. She bent down, lifted the apron with both hands, and carried it to Nell as carefully as if it were church linen. Her yellow hair had come loose from one ribbon. Her cheeks were red from the cold. She looked up at Nell, not at her size, not at the mud, not at the town watching, but straight into her face. "Is this yours, ma'am?" she asked. Nell's throat closed around the answer. She lowered herself slowly until her knees touched the dirt, because no child should have to crane her neck to offer kindness. "Yes, little miss," she said, taking the apron. "Thank you." Millie frowned at the muddy corner. It got ruined. Nell brushed the wet dirt gently from the cloth. "No, sweetheart. Some things still deserve washing." Caleb Whitfield heard that. Nell saw it in the way his hand stilled. On the reins, in the way his eyes shifted from the apron to her face as if, for the first time that morning, he had seen more than a woman standing inside a joke. Mrs. Harrow gave a thin laugh. "Well, Caleb, you had best mind your child. Soft hearts catch trouble." Millie stepped closer to Nell and caught one fold of her skirt in a small fist. Clara gasped. Thomas muttered her name. Caleb crossed the street in 3 long steps and stopped an arm's length away. "Millie," he said, quieter now, "come here." But Millie did not let go. Nell looked down at the child's hand and then up at the man whose face had been carved by work, weather, and some old sorrow no one dared touch. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "I didn't mean to trouble your girl." Caleb looked at the auction table at the town, at Mrs. Harrow smiling like she had already won, and finally back at Nell Harper kneeling in the dust with her mother's apron pressed to her chest. "How much for the apron?" he asked. Mr. Haskett blinked. "Pardon?" "The apron," Caleb said. "Name your price." Nell stood before anyone could answer. "It isn't for sale." Her voice was not loud, but it held. "Everything on that table is for sale," Haskett said. "Not that." The laughter had thinned now. People leaned in, hungry for a different kind of spectacle. Caleb reached into his coat and laid a silver dollar on the table. "Then I'm not buying it." He turned to Nell. "I'm buying breakfast for 6 children who haven't had a proper one in weeks. Can you cook, Mrs. Harper?" The street seemed to lose every sound at once. Nell looked at the 6 children. At Thomas pretending not to hope. At Clara guarding her heart with both eyes. At Henry trying to look bored. At Luke studying her apron. At Rose silent as snowfall. At Millie still holding her skirt like she had found something she meant to keep. Nell swallowed. "Yes, sir," she said. "I can cook." Caleb nodded once. 30 days. Kitchen only. "You don't mother my children." Nell folded the apron over her arm, lifted her chin, and met the town stare without flinching. "Children decide who mothers them, Mr. Whitfield," she said softly. "Not hired women." For the first time all morning nobody laughed. Caleb Whitfield did not offer Nell his hand when she climbed onto the wagon, and Nell was grateful for that small mercy, because help given in front of a laughing town could sometimes feel like another kind of humiliation. She gathered her mother's apron against her middle, placed one worn boot on the iron step, and pulled herself up with care, steady and quiet, while every eye along Main Street measured the width of her body, the mud on her skirt, and the strange little fact that a widowed rancher with 6 children had just hired the woman Cedar Ridge had spent years learning how to mock. Mrs. Harrow stood stiff beneath her bonnet, her mouth pinched so tight it looked sewn shut. "Caleb Whitfield," she called, "you cannot mean to take that woman into your home." Caleb settled a sack of oats into the wagon bed, as if she had commented on the weather. "I mean to feed my children. There are decent girls in this town who would take kitchen work. Then they should have come when my cook left. Perhaps they knew better." At that, Caleb looked at her. Not long. Not loudly. Just enough to make Mrs. Harrow smooth her gloves and step back half an inch. Nell kept her eyes on the boards beneath her feet. She had no wish to be the spark that set off a public quarrel. Public quarrels always found a way to burn the woman first. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I can walk behind if the wagon is full." 6 young faces turned toward her. Henry gave a small snort. Clara's mouth tightened. Thomas looked at Caleb as if waiting for his father to correct the arrangement before it became embarrassing. Caleb climbed onto the bench and took the reins. "You will ride." Nell nodded once and sat on the back edge of the wagon, leaving as much space as she could between herself and the children. Millie tried to sit beside her, but Clara pulled her gently back. "No," Clara whispered. "You do not know her." Millie's lower lip trembled, but she did not cry. Nell pretended not to hear. She watched Cedar Ridge slide past in pieces. The barber pole, the church steps, the mercantile window. The men who had laughed now standing with their hats low and their curiosity high. The wagon rolled out past the last hitching post, and only when the town became a line of roofs behind them did Caleb speak. 30 days, he said. Room by the pantry. Wages every Saturday. You cook breakfast, dinner, and supper. Laundry if you have time. I do not expect miracles. That is fortunate, Nell said. I have never been mistaken for one. Henry laughed before he could stop himself. Clara shot him a look. Caleb did not turn around, but Nell saw his shoulder shift, just barely. You will not discipline my children, he continued. You will not speak ill of their mother. You will not go through her things. You will not invite town talk onto my porch. And you will not make promises to them. Nell looked at the 6 children packed along the wagon bed like little witnesses at a trial. Rose sat with her hands folded, eyes fixed on the road. Luke watched Nell's apron as if he suspected it might contain food. Thomas stared straight ahead, jaw tight, trying hard to look older than 14. I do not make promises to children unless I can keep them, Nell said. Good. And I do not steal a dead woman's place. The reins creaked in Caleb's hands. The horses kept walking slow and steady over the rutted road. For several seconds nobody spoke. Wind moved over the open Wyoming grass, carrying the smell of dust, pine, and distant rain. Then Clara said, sharp as a needle, "Our mother made apple butter every fall." Nell turned her head. Then she must have had patience. Apple butter does not hurry for anyone. Clara blinked, as if she had expected pity and received something harder to argue with. She sang when she stirred it, Luke said softly. Thomas nudged him, but Nell answered before the boy could fold back into silence. That helps the waiting. Caleb said nothing. The ranch appeared after another mile, low and weathered against the hills, with a barn leaning slightly east and a porch that looked as if it had forgotten footsteps. No smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. No dog barked. No curtain moved. It was not an empty house, Nell thought. It was worse. It was a house holding its breath. Caleb drew the wagon to a stop. The children climbed down one by one. Millie looked back at Nell, hopeful. Nell stepped carefully to the ground and adjusted the apron over her arm. Thomas came around the wagon before she could follow Caleb inside. He was tall for his age, but his eyes were too tired for a boy. "Mrs. Harper," he said, voice low enough that his father would not hear. "Yes." His throat worked once. "We do not need another woman dying in our house." Nell held his gaze, and all the cold road dust seemed to settle between them. "Then I will start by making breakfast," she said. "And we will see what living can still be done." The kitchen at Whitfield Ranch looked less like a room where meals were made and more like a place grief had closed the door on and forgotten. Cold ashes sat in the stove belly. A sack of flour leaned open in the corner with a tin scoop buried halfway down. 3 cracked mugs waited near the pump, one with old coffee dried along the rim. There were 6 small chairs around the table and 1 large chair at the head, but the space beside Caleb's place was empty, polished by absence in a way that made Nell's eyes move away from it at once. She set her mother's apron on the counter and washed her hands in water so cold it made her knuckles ache. Behind her, the children gathered in the doorway without crossing the threshold, as if the kitchen belonged to a memory that might wake if they stepped too loudly. Caleb stood behind them, hat still on, shoulders filling the frame. "This is the kitchen," he said. "You will sleep through there by the pantry. There is a cot." "It is not much." "A cot is more than a street," Nell said. Henry made a face. "She talks funny." "Henry," Caleb said. The boy looked down but not ashamed, only bored with being corrected. Nell opened the stove door and studied the ashes. "When was the last proper fire in here?" Thomas answered before his father could. "Yesterday." Clara crossed her arms. "If you call smoke and burned mush proper." Thomas turned on her. "You did not have to eat it." "Neither did you, but you scraped the pot." "Because Luke was still hungry." Luke's cheeks reddened. He slipped behind Thomas, small for 6, one hand pressed flat over his stomach as if he could silence it. Nell saw that and said nothing. A hungry child did not need attention drawn to hunger. He needed food put where his pride could reach it. Millie wandered in first, dragging one ribbon loose from her hair. She stopped beside Nell's skirt and touched the apron folded on the counter. "Are you going to wear it?" "After I wash it." "It is pretty." Clara stepped forward and took Millie's hand away. "It is muddy." "Muddy things can be washed," Millie said, repeating Nell with solemn care. Caleb's eyes moved briefly to Nell, then away. Rose stayed at the back. 8 years old, thin wrists, dark hair in 2 uneven braids, face pale and watchful. She did not speak. She held a wooden button in her palm and rubbed it with her thumb over and over. Nell recognized the motion. Some children kept toys. Some kept prayers. Some kept the last thing that still felt connected to the person gone. "That is Rose," Caleb said quietly, as if her name might startle her. "She understands you. She just does not talk much." Rose's fingers closed around the button. Nell gave one small nod, not pitying, not pressing. "Then I will not crowd her with words." Something changed in the room. Not warmth yet. Only a hinge easing. Caleb cleared his throat. "My rules stand. You cook. You keep to the kitchen and pantry. You do not go into the upstairs rooms. You do not sort through my wife's things. You do not correct the children unless they are in danger. You leave when I say the arrangement is finished. Nell took the ash bucket, careful with its weight. Yes, sir. And you do not make them need you. That made her pause. The room went still enough for the wind outside to sound close. Nell looked at the 6 children, at Thomas carrying manhood like an oversized coat, at Clara with suspicion sharpened into manners, at Henry kicking the table leg because stillness hurt him, at Luke watching the pantry door, at Rose clutching her button, at Millie leaning toward kindness because she had not yet learned to fear it. Then she looked back at Caleb. Need is not something I hand out, Mr. Whitfield. It is something children carry until somebody notices. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. He turned to leave, then stopped when Nell opened the pantry. There was cornmeal, dried beans, a little salt pork, half a crock of lard, potatoes with eyes growing, and enough flour to get through a week if she measured with care. It was not plenty, but it was something. Nell rolled up her sleeves. Thomas, would you bring in kindling? The boy stiffened. Pa said you cannot order us. I asked because the stove cannot answer. Henry snorted again, and this time Caleb almost did too, though he hid it by reaching for the door latch. Thomas hesitated, then went outside. Nell pointed gently toward a bucket. Henry, if that pump works, water would make supper more likely. I am not your hand. No, Nell said. You are a boy with 2 good arms and an empty belly. Henry stared at her, deciding whether to be insulted, then grabbed the bucket and stomped out. Clara remained in the doorway. You think you are clever. Nell shook ash into the pail. No. I think your father is tired, your brothers are hungry, your sister is scared, and this stove has been waiting on someone too long. Clara's face shifted, just a flicker, before she hardened it again. By dusk, the stove had a small fire, the table had been wiped clean, and potatoes hissed in a black skillet. The house did not feel healed. Not even close. But smoke rose from the chimney, and for the first time since Nell arrived, no one laughed. That night, when the children had gone upstairs and Caleb had stepped out to check the barn, Nell lay awake on the pantry cot beneath her patched blanket. The house creaked around her. A coyote called far beyond the fence line. Then through the thin wall she heard it. One small, careful sob quickly swallowed. Nell opened her eyes in the dark and did not move. Rose was crying where nobody had thought to listen. Nell did not go to Rose that night. She sat up on the pantry cot with both feet on the cold floorboards and listened until the small crying faded into the walls, because some hurt ran from footsteps and only trusted silence. Before dawn she rose in the dark, washed her face at the pump, tied her damp apron around her waist and moved through the kitchen by touch. The stove took 3 tries before the flame caught, but once it did, the room began to change. Flour softened beneath her palms. Lard disappeared into the dough. Potatoes struck the skillet with a quiet hiss. Gravy thickened in the pan, pale and warm, while coffee breathed its bitter comfort into the air. Outside, the Wyoming morning was still gray, the kind of cold that made fence posts look lonely. Inside, Nell worked until the table no longer looked like a place where children came to be quiet. It looked like a place waiting to feed them. Thomas came down first, boots in hand so he would not wake the others, and stopped at the sight of biscuits rising golden in the oven. You are up early, he said. So are you. I checked the water troughs. Then you will need breakfast. He looked at the table as though permission had to be earned before sitting. Nell set a plate at Caleb's chair and 6 more around it. Food gets cold whether a boy trusts it or not. Thomas did not smile, but he sat. Clara entered with Millie on her hip, trying to look unimpressed and failing when the smell of gravy reached her. Henry came next, hair standing every direction, and announced, If it tastes burned, I am not eating. Nell slid a biscuit onto his plate. Then it is lucky for both of us I did not burn it. Luke drifted in last before Rose, his eyes fixed on the basket of biscuits as if counting how many would be left after everyone else took one. Nell noticed. She placed 2 on his plate and wrapped a third in a clean cloth near the edge of the table, not naming it, not looking at him when his hand quietly covered it. Then Rose appeared in the doorway. Her face was washed. Her braids were still uneven. The wooden button was in her fist. Caleb came in behind her, hat in hand, and the room tightened around him. He looked at the food, then at Nell, then at his children already seated. You did all this before sunup? Breakfast prefers to arrive before hunger gets mean, Nell said. Henry took the first bite with the grim determination of a judge. He chewed. His eyes widened, then narrowed, offended by pleasure. It is all right, he said, and reached for another biscuit before finishing the first. Clara tasted the gravy. Her shoulders lowered 1 inch. Thomas ate slowly, as if each bite might cost the family something. Millie swung her feet and whispered, "It tastes warm." Caleb stood by the stove a moment too long before taking his chair. He ate without praise, but he cleaned the plate. Nell stayed near the counter, hands busy with the coffee pot, letting them have the meal without her shadow falling across it. Then Rose moved. The little girl slid from her chair, crossed the room and came to Nell's side. Every fork paused. Rose touched 2 fingers to Nell's wrist, so light it was almost not a touch at all. Nell looked down but did not bend too quickly. Yes, honey. Rose's mouth trembled. Her eyes flicked toward Caleb, then toward the table, then back to Nell. Her voice came out small, rusty from disuse, but clear enough to stop the morning. Do not tell Pa, I cried. The silence that followed seemed to lift the roof and hold it there. Caleb's fork slipped from his hand and struck the plate with a soft clink. Thomas stared. Clara covered her mouth. Luke froze with the hidden biscuit halfway into his pocket. Henry stopped pretending not to care. Nell did not gasp. She did not call Rose brave. She did not turn the child into a miracle for grown folks to admire. She only covered Rose's small hand with her own flour-dusted fingers and said, "Some tears are private. I know how to keep a kitchen secret." Rose nodded once, then leaned against Nell's side for the length of one breath before returning to her chair. Caleb pushed back from the table and stepped outside without a word. Nell watched him through the window. He stood on the porch with both hands braced on the rail, his head bowed, the cold morning moving around him. A minute later he came back in, quieter than before. The children had begun eating again, but carefully now, as if the room had become holy. Caleb walked to the stove where Nell was rinsing the skillet. "Mrs. Harper," he said. "Yes, sir." His voice stayed low, rough around the edges. "How did you get her to speak?" Nell looked at Rose, who was breaking a biscuit into careful pieces. "I did not get her to do anything." Caleb waited. Nell dried her hands on her apron. "I just heard what the rest of this house was too tired to hear." By the third evening, the Whitfield kitchen had begun to keep time by Nell Harper's hands. Coffee before sunrise, biscuits by the first pale light, beans soaking before noon, supper set before the children could turn hunger into quarrels. She did not move quickly, but she moved steadily, the way a woman moved when she had learned that every step in life cost something and had decided to pay it anyway. Caleb noticed more than he meant to. He noticed how she leaned one hip against the counter when she thought no one watched. He noticed how she carried the heavy water bucket with both hands and set it down without a sound, though her breath caught afterward. He noticed how she smiled at Millie without letting the smile beg to be returned. Most of all, he noticed her boots. They were old black boots, cracked at the bend, too narrow across the toes, and worn thin at the heel. That night, after the children had gone upstairs and the kitchen had settled into the blue quiet that came after dishes were washed, Nell stood by the stove rolling dough for morning bread. Caleb came in from the barn with cold on his coat and stopped when he saw one of her feet lift slightly from the floor, then lower again as if she had scolded it into obedience. "Sit down," he said. Nell kept rolling. "Bread will not rise because I rest. Bread can wait. Children cannot. The children are asleep. Then morning is coming." Caleb took one step closer and saw the truth where the hem of her dress had shifted. Her stockings were worn through at the heel, and the skin beneath looked raw from miles of walking and days of standing. His jaw tightened. "How far did you walk before I hired you?" Nell pressed the rolling pin forward. "Far enough to arrive." "That is not an answer." "It is the one I have." He crossed to the washstand, filled a basin with warm water from the kettle, and set it near the chair. The sound made her turn. "Mr. Whitfield, I do not need tending. I did not ask what you needed." Her hand stilled on the dough. "Men usually say that before they take something." Caleb looked at her then, fully, and the room seemed to narrow around the stove light. I am not taking anything from you. Nell's fingers curled into the flour. For a moment, she looked more frightened of kindness than she had ever looked of laughter. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and sat, but she did not give him her foot. Caleb understood. He turned his chair sideways, facing the stove instead of her, and pushed the basin closer with his boot. I will look at the fire, he said. You keep your pride. Nell stared at the side of his face for a long breath. Then she slipped one boot off with both hands. The boot made a tired sound when it touched the floor. She placed her foot into the warm water and closed her eyes, just once, too briefly to be called relief. There was a man once, she said. Caleb did not move. Edgar Pike. He owned a dry goods counter in Laramie, and wore his hair with more care than most women wore their Sunday hats. He asked me to marry him because my father had left me a little money, and because his shelves were emptier than his pride could bear. Caleb watched the fire. You cared for him? I cared for the version of him that spoke softly when no one else was near. Her mouth lifted without warmth. On the wedding morning, his friends came early. They had been drinking coffee outside the church and making wagers on whether the wagon team could pull me to the door. One of them said Edgar would need 2 horses for his bride. Another said the church floor might not forgive me. Caleb's hands closed slowly over his knees. Nell's voice stayed even, which made it worse. Edgar laughed because they were watching. Then he told me he could not shame himself before the town. He left through the side door. I stood there holding flowers I had paid for myself. The stove popped. Upstairs a floorboard creaked, then settled. After that, Nell said, people stopped calling me Miss Harper. I became that big Harper woman, that poor Harper woman, that woman no man wanted unless he needed a stove filled. Caleb turned his head just enough to see her profile in the firelight. That is why you would not sell the apron. My mother wore it when my father loved her. I wore it when I thought I might have a home of my own. It may be old, but it remembers better things than Cedar Ridge does. Caleb reached for the clean cloth on the table and set it beside the basin without touching her. You should not have had to stand alone in that church. Nell looked at the water, at the flower on her wrists, at the man who had given her space instead of questions. Standing alone was not the worst part, she said. The worst part was learning how many people felt entertained by it. Before Caleb could answer, a horse passed on the road beyond the yard, moving toward town under a late moon. Neither of them knew yet that Edgar Pike had arrived in Cedar Ridge before dark, or that by morning he would be leaning against Haskett's counter, telling anyone who would listen that Nell Harper had finally found a widower desperate enough to hide her under his roof. The rumor reached Whitfield Ranch by way of a flower delivery, and a boy too young to know when silence was kinder than news. By noon, Nell had heard enough from the driver's careless mouth to understand that Edgar Pike was in Cedar Ridge, smiling over counters, polishing old shame until it shone new again. She kept her hands in the bread dough and did not look at Caleb, though she felt him watching from the doorway. People talk when their own kitchens are cold, she said before he could ask. Let them. Caleb's jaw worked once, but he only took the sack of flour from the driver and carried it inside himself. That afternoon, the house seemed to gather around Nell without anyone deciding it should. Thomas came in from the barn with a torn glove and a face too proud to ask for mending. Nell took the glove, threaded a needle and said, "A man can be tired and still be useful tomorrow." Thomas looked at the floor. "Pa needs me. Your father needs a son more than he needs a second father." The boy stood still, blinking hard at the stove pipe, and when she handed the glove back he said, "Thank you, Mrs. Harper," in a voice that had lost some of its borrowed age. Clara came next, pretending to search for a clean dish towel. She lingered near the shelf where Nell had set sliced apples to dry. "Mama used cinnamon," Clara said. Nell did not turn it into a confession. "Then cinnamon it is. You do not know her recipe." "No," Nell said, measuring sugar with care. "But you might." Clara's mouth trembled with the effort of staying guarded. She stepped closer, picked up the spoon, and showed Nell how her mother had stirred apple pie filling from the outside of the bowl inward, slow so the fruit would not bruise. Henry arrived after that with mud on both cuffs and a scowl meant to keep questions away. He had tracked dirt from the yard clear to the table. Caleb would have barked his name from across the room. Nell simply set a basin on the floor and said, "Hands first, boots second, pride last." "You are not my mother," Henry muttered. "That is true." "Then stop telling me what to do." "I am not telling you what to do. I am telling the mud where it does not belong." Luke laughed and Henry tried not to, but the corner of his mouth gave him away. He washed without another word. Rose sat near the stove with her wooden button in her palm, quiet as always, but when Nell began humming while rolling pie crust, the girl moved her chair 2 inches closer. Nell stopped humming. Rose looked up, alarmed. "No," she whispered. "Keep going." Nell kept going, soft and low, and Rose leaned back as if the sound had given her permission to rest. Later, Luke slipped into the pantry and froze when Nell found him with 1 biscuit in each hand. His eyes filled before she spoke. Nell knelt slowly, took a small tin from the shelf, and filled it with 4 biscuits wrapped in a cloth. "This is yours," she said. "You do not have to steal food that already wants to feed you." Luke hugged the tin to his chest so hard his knuckles whitened. Millie lasted until supper before crawling into Nell's lap, while the others argued over the last wedge of pie. She fell asleep there with one cheek against Nell's apron, warm and trusting, as if the whole world had become the size of a kitchen chair. Caleb watched from the head of the table, his fork untouched, his expression caught between gratitude and fear. When the children had gone upstairs, he found Nell scraping plates at the sink. "You are making them need you," he said. Nell did not stop washing. "No, sir. They already needed someone. I just answered." "And when 30 days end?" Her hand stilled beneath the water. "Then you will decide whether this house is better with me gone." Caleb looked toward the staircase, where Millie had left one ribbon tied around the banister and Thomas had forgotten to carry his father's old lantern back to the hook. "That is not as simple as it was." Before Nell could answer, a folded envelope slid under the kitchen door and came to rest near her boot. Caleb picked it up. The paper smelled faintly of rosewater and church dust. Nell knew the handwriting before he read the name aloud. Mrs. Violet Harrow invited Mrs. Eleanor Harper to assist at the Cedar Ridge church supper on Friday evening, in the spirit of fellowship, charity, and moral concern. Caleb crumpled the edge of the paper without meaning to. Nell dried her hands slowly. "That is not an invitation," she said. "No," Caleb answered, looking toward the dark window where town lights flickered 3 miles away. "It is a trap." Friday evening came in low and gray, with rain tapping the porch roof and turning the road to Cedar Ridge into 3 miles of black mud. Caleb hitched the wagon himself and said nothing when Nell climbed onto the bench beside Clara instead of into the back. She wore her brown dress brushed clean, her mother's apron folded in a basket beneath 2 apple pies, and her hair pinned with more care than the town had ever deserved from her. The children were quiet all the way in. Thomas sat with his shoulders squared. Henry kept kicking the wagon board until Clara hissed his name. Luke held his biscuit tin in both hands. Rose watched Nell from beneath her lashes, and Millie leaned against her side as if the road might try to steal her away. The church hall glowed with lantern light when they arrived, every window bright, every face inside already turned toward the door before Caleb even helped the children down. Nell felt the attention land on her body first, then her basket, then Caleb standing near enough that folks could count it. Mrs. Violet Harrow came forward wearing a lavender dress and a smile sharp enough to peel apples. "Mrs. Harper, how generous of you to come. We have placed you near the serving table, where your talents will be most useful." Caleb's hand tightened around his hat. Nell touched the basket handle. "A useful place is nothing to be ashamed of." Mrs. Harrow's smile thinned. "How comforting that you think so." Inside, the church supper smelled of boiled ham, coffee, yeast rolls, and judgment. Women in clean gloves moved dishes along the tables while men stood in clusters pretending not to listen. Nell set her pies where she was told, at the far end beneath a window that let in a draft. For the first hour, she served plates, poured coffee, and answered every small cruelty with courtesy. "A little less gravy for me," one woman said. "Some of us must be careful." "Of course," Nell answered. "Care is never wasted." A man looked at Caleb and chuckled. "Whitfield, your house must be eating better than the rest of us these days." Caleb did not smile. "It is." The children stayed close. Clara helped with napkins. Luke carried spoons. Rose stood by Nell's skirt and said nothing. though her fingers brushed the apron pocket twice. Then Edgar Pike walked in as if the room had invited him just to complete the insult. He wore a tan coat too fine for the mud outside and a red cravat bright enough to announce himself before his voice did. Nell felt him before she saw him. Her hands went still around the coffee pot. Edgar removed his hat with a little bow. "Eleanor Harper," he said. "Still feeding rooms that will not keep you." Caleb turned. The church hall softened into silence. Mrs. Harrow did not look surprised. "Mr. Pike has been passing through Cedar Ridge," she said. "He mentioned you were once acquainted." Edgar laughed lightly. "Acquainted is a kind word. I nearly made a brave mistake once." Few people smiled. Henry stepped forward, but Thomas caught his sleeve. Nell set the coffee pot down with care. "Good evening, Edgar." "That is all," he said. "No hard words for the man who spared you a disappointing marriage?" Her throat tightened, but her voice did not. "I learned not to waste hard words on soft men." The room shifted. Caleb's eyes moved to her, and for one small moment, pride warmed his face before he hid it. Mrs. Harrow struck her spoon against a glass. "Friends, since we are gathered in fellowship, I believe it is our duty to speak plainly about the welfare of children in this community." Nell knew then that the pies, the supper, the invitation, even Edgar's entrance had all been arranged like chairs before a trial. Mrs. Harrow turned toward Caleb. "A ranch with 6 young children requires more than hot biscuits. It requires moral steadiness, proper example, and a woman above reproach." Caleb's voice came low. "Choose your next words carefully." Mrs. Harrow lifted her chin. "A woman may fill a kitchen, Mr. Whitfield, but that does not mean she can fill a mother's place." Clara went pale. Rose pressed closer to Nell. Edgar gave a soft laugh from near the coffee urn. "I can testify she was not suited for a bride." Nell laid one hand on Rose's shoulder and stepped away from the serving table. Her knees wanted to shake, so she planted them harder. "You may laugh at the size of me," she said, looking from Edgar to Mrs. Harrow to every face pretending innocence. "You may laugh at my dress, my hands, my empty purse, and the apron my mother left me. You have practiced enough. But do not laugh in front of children and call it righteousness." No one moved. Even the lanterns seemed quieter. Mrs. Harrow's cheeks colored, but she recovered quickly. "This is exactly the temper I feared. Sheriff Nolan has agreed that if concerns continue, a petition may be filed to review whether the Whitfield children are being kept in a proper household." Millie made a small frightened sound. Luke clutched his tin to his chest. Caleb stepped between Mrs. Harrow and Nell, but the damage had already crossed the room and found the children. Nell looked at Thomas, Clara, Henry, Rose, Luke, and Millie, and understood with a coldness that reached past shame. The town did not only want her humbled, it wanted her gone, and it had found the one threat big enough to make her consider leaving on her own. At first light, Nell packed her apron before she packed her dress. The kitchen was still dark, the stove cold, the children asleep above her, and every sound she made seemed too large for a house she had never meant to hurt. She folded her mother's apron with both hands, pressing each corner flat, because if she let her fingers tremble, she feared the rest of her would follow. In the pantry, the little cot had already stopped feeling like charity. A clean towel hung from a peg. Luke's biscuit tin sat on the shelf where he could reach it. One of Millie's ribbons lay beside Nell's comb. Clara's pie spoon rested near the flour jar, washed and shining. Rose's wooden button had been left on the table the night before, not forgotten but trusted. Nell looked at those small signs of belonging and felt something inside her pull tight. Then she placed them all back exactly where they belonged and tied her bundle shut. Caleb found her by the back door with her coat over one arm. He had not shaved. His eyes looked as if sleep had passed him by and gone on to kinder houses. "Where are you going?" he asked. Nell kept her voice low. "Before the children wake." "That is not an answer. It is the cleanest one I have." He stepped into the kitchen, blocking none of the door, but filling the room all the same. "Nell." It was the first time he had said her given name. She looked down at the bundle. "If I stay, Mrs. Harrow will come with papers. Sheriff Nolan will come with questions. Edgar will stand there smiling while your children listen. I know what towns do when they want a woman gone. They do not stop at the woman." Caleb's hand closed around the back of a chair. You think leaving protects them? I think staying gives people a weapon. They are already using one. Before she could answer, the sound of wheels rolled into the yard. Not one wagon. Two. Nell turned toward the window. Mrs. Harrow stepped down first, dressed in gray as if she had come for duty rather than damage. Sheriff Nolan followed, hat in hand, face uneasy. Edgar Pike leaned against the second wagon with his arms folded, wearing the smile of a man certain the ending had been written for him. Caleb opened the kitchen door before they could knock. Cold air swept in across the floor. State your business, he said. Mrs. Harrow lifted a folded paper. We are here out of concern for the welfare of the Whitfield children. My children are under my roof. And that is precisely the concern. Nell moved forward. I was just leaving. Caleb turned his head. No, Mr. Whitfield. No, his voice did not rise, but the word settled like a fence post driven deep. Mrs. Harrow's eyes brightened. How noble. But if the woman herself admits she should go, perhaps we can avoid unpleasantness. There has been nothing pleasant about you since the day you opened your mouth in my town, Caleb said. Edgar laughed softly. Careful, Whitfield. You are tying your good name to a poor bargain. The stairs creaked. Thomas stood halfway down in his nightshirt, hair rough from sleep. Clara appeared behind him, then Henry, then Luke clutching his tin, then Rose with her button in one hand, and Millie last, small and barefoot, blinking at the cold. Nell's heart sank. Go back upstairs, she whispered. No one moved. Millie saw the bundle in Nell's hand. Her face changed first, crumpling with an understanding no 4-year-old should have to carry. You are going away? Nell could not answer. Luke came down 2 steps. But breakfast is not made. Henry swallowed. That is a foolish thing to say. It is true, Luke whispered. Rose moved past Clara, slow and pale, until she stood on the kitchen floor. Her voice shook, but it came. Papa, do not let her go. Every adult outside heard it. Caleb went still. Mrs. Harrow's paper lowered an inch. Then Thomas stepped down beside Rose, no longer pretending to be a man, only standing as a son. She stayed when we were awful. Clara came next, chin high though her eyes shone. She did not try to replace Mama. Henry wiped his nose on his sleeve and scowled at Edgar as if daring the man to laugh. She feeds us even when we act mean. Luke held up his tin. She always saves me one. Rose reached for Nell's hand. She heard me. Millie ran then crossing the kitchen in her bare feet, and wrapped both arms around Nell's skirt. She is home. The words went out the open door and struck the yard silent. Sheriff Nolan looked at the ground. Edgar's smile faded at the edges. Mrs. Harrow drew herself up, but whatever speech she had prepared could not find a place to stand. Caleb stepped onto the porch, putting himself between Nell, the children, and the town that had come to take dignity from his doorway. His voice carried across the wet yard, calm enough to frighten every roomer waiting in the wagons. You laughed at her once. You will not do it on my land. You will not use my children to punish the woman who fed them, listened to them, and gave this house back its breath. My children chose her. And so do I. Nell stood behind him with Millie clinging to her skirt, Rose holding her hand, and the bundle slipping from her fingers to the floor. For the first time in her life, she had been publicly chosen, and the whole town had no laughter left to spend. Spring came to Whitfield Ranch slowly, first as a softening at the edge of the creek, then as green pushing through the brown grass, then as children's voices carrying clear across the yard where silence used to sit like an old debt. 3 months after the morning the wagons left without her, Nell Harper could walk through the kitchen before sunrise and know every sound by heart. Thomas splitting kindling with less weight on his shoulders. Clara measuring cinnamon by scent instead of suspicion. Henry arguing with the rooster and losing. Luke opening his biscuit tin just to make sure it was still full. Rose humming under her breath while she polished her wooden button on her sleeve. Millie dragging a chair to the counter because she was certain any dough made without her help would be lonely. The house had not forgotten its sorrow. The empty place at the table was still treated gently. Caleb still paused sometimes at the foot of the stairs as if listening for a voice that would not come back. Nell never tried to fill those spaces with herself. She only kept the stove warm beside them. That was how healing came, not like thunder, not like a miracle shouted across a church hall, but like bread rising under a clean towel, quiet and patient, becoming more than it had been. Cedar Ridge changed slower. Mrs. Harrow stopped visiting the mercantile on days Caleb's wagon stood outside. Sheriff Nolan tipped his hat to Nell now, awkward but sincere. Edgar Pike left town before the first thaw finished, after too many doors closed politely in his face and too many children stared at him as if he were something tracked across a clean floor. People still whispered, because people did not surrender cruelty all at once, but they whispered softer when the 6 Whitfield children were near. One Saturday, a woman outside Haskett's looked Nell up and down with the old measuring eyes, and before a single word could leave her mouth, Henry stepped in front of Nell with a sack of sugar under one arm and said, "Ma'am, if you have got something sour to say, we have already got vinegar at home." Nell nearly dropped the coffee beans. Caleb turned away to hide his smile. That evening after supper, the children were sent to wash up, though none of them went far. Nell knew because the stairs had learned to creak in 6 different ways. She was wiping flour from the table when Caleb came in from the porch carrying something wrapped in brown paper. He set it beside her hand. "For the kitchen," he said. Nell opened it and found a new apron. White cotton with blue stitching along the pocket, plain and sturdy and wide enough to tie without shame. Beneath it lay her mother's old apron, washed clean, mended carefully, the torn corner stitched with thread so fine she had to touch it to believe it. Clara helped, Caleb said. Rose chose the thread. Millie insisted both aprons belonged on the same hook. Nell looked toward the stove, where the old peg waited beside the one that had once held his wife's apron. Her throat tightened but her hand stayed steady. "That is a generous place to hang it." Caleb took off his hat and held it in both hands. He looked more nervous than he had the day he faced the town in his own yard. "It is not charity, Nell." The sound of her name in his voice was still a thing she had not grown used to. "Then what is it?" He stepped closer, leaving room enough for her to choose the distance. "It is a question I should have asked before my children answered it for me." The stairs went quiet. Even Henry stopped breathing loudly. Caleb glanced upward once, then back at her. "I do not need you to become smaller for this house. This house needed a heart big enough to hold all of us." Nell looked at his weathered hands, at the flour still on her own, at the supper plates drying by the sink, at the fire burning low and gold inside the stove. She thought of the town laughing, of the auction table, of mud on her mother's apron, of all the years she had been told she took up too much room. Then Millie's whisper floated from the stairwell, far too loud to be hidden. "Say yes, Miss Nell." Clara hushed her. Luke giggled. Thomas coughed like a man and failed completely. Rose said, soft but clear, "Please." Nell laughed then, not because anyone had been cruel, not because she needed to cover hurt, but because joy had finally found a place in her body and asked to be let out. Caleb's eyes warmed. "Would you stay?" he asked. "Not for wages, not for pity, not because 6 children cornered you on the stairs, but because you want this life with us?" Nell lifted the new apron and the old one together, carried them to the stove, and hung them side by side. Outside, evening settled over the ranch in blue and gold. Inside, 6 children came tumbling down the stairs before anyone gave them permission, and Caleb Whitfield